There is a tremendously harrowing frozen image of retribution. A day later, and it's actually called the 3rd of May, and the mobsters have been rounded up and they face a firing squad. And you can pick out some of the major protagonists in the previous painting here in this work, with a figure here in the foreground lying in a sticky pool of blood, clearly recognisable as the figure in the right-hand foreground of the 2nd of May stabbing a horse, and the man illuminated facing the firing squad, staring unflinchingly at them, but with the look of horror on his face, is also visible as the man stabbing the French soldier who seems to be suspended in thin air in the previous painting. And then we have this amazingly anonymous, machine-like firing squad, their backs to us, partly inviting us to look over their shoulders and cast ourselves in the role of aggressors. It's a fantastically staged but claustrophobic image. The hill pushing in on one side, the darkness descending on another, and then this eerie glow from the lantern that illuminates the figure and in a way gives the central image the strongest resonance, because look at the pose of the figure there. Arms out, and look at his palms, and you see blood marks, the stigmata, the Christ-like figure, and this is an image of martyrdom. And of course what Goya is doing in these pictures is proclaiming that this is the horrors of war writ large, or painted on the largest scale that Goya can muster. And secondly, and more politically, by 1814, for Spain, the French, and Napoleon in particular, is cast as the Antichrist.
With the war over, Goya came under investigation for his collaboration with the French, as he and other liberals had initially welcomed what they saw as progressive reform. So Goya faced the Inquisition, which had been reinstated by the new despotic king, Ferdinand VII. Although no charges were ever brought against Goya, and he managed to keep his position as a court painter, as well as his annual salary, no further royal commissions ever came his way. And whilst all this was going on, Goya was also struck with a personal loss. In 1812, his wife Josefa died. A few years later, in 1819, now in his mid-70s, Goya bought a small house just outside Madrid called Quinta del Sordo, or the House of the Deaf Man. There he lived with his new companion and housekeeper, Leocadia Weiss, and her daughter. Once again, Goya became seriously ill, but on his recovery, he started to paint a series of works directly onto the walls of 2 rooms in the house, which are known to us today as the Black Paintings.
This painting seems to have been dug from the depths of Goya's Gothic imagination, but it also has its precedents in classical mythology and in the art of the more recent past. But here, in Goya's hands, the thing is much more monstrous. The story goes that Saturn was told by Mother Earth that his children would eventually usurp him, and so he bites the heads off each and every one of them to kill them as an act of kind of self-preservation. But here, the image that Goya gives us isn't of a god in control. In fact, he's lost the plot. He's unbalanced and unhinged. And when the work was first painted on the wall of the House of the Deaf Man, it sported a full erection, an horrendous image of sexual gratification, where Saturn is presented as life-giver as well as life-taker. But either through censorship or when the works were transferred onto canvas and then brought here to the Prado, that was lost. And what we have with this god of melancholy is a dark, brooding, horrific scene that perhaps mirrors something of the pessimism and sense of imprisonment that Goya himself is feeling.
Here, Goya returns to a scene that he'd painted some 32 years earlier, that of San Isidro. But the happy picnickers are now replaced by something much gloomier. The pilgrims cluster together, their mouths gaping wide open on their distorted faces as they try to sing. And suddenly, individual rational beings seem lost in a seething, irrational mass of humanity. With Spain still in ongoing political turmoil, Goya decided to go into exile. He petitioned the king for permission to visit France for reasons of health, and it was given, and so Goya headed to Bordeaux.
And it was while he was living in Bordeaux that Goya produced his last major oil painting, this one, called The Milkmaid of Bordeaux, showing a doughy-eyed, slightly melancholic woman staring off into space with a milk churn on the left-hand side of the picture, on which Goya has scratched his name as an artist of 81. And some people have interpreted this work as a sign that in his old age he's increasingly experimental, and to a certain extent he was. And they say that this work, in its brushstrokes, in its looseness, in this hazy impressionism, anticipates the works of French artists later on in the century. But I think perhaps that's overstating the case. For me, the strongest feeling that you get from this work is nostalgia, but also of a man who's found some kind of peace, harmony and resolution in his life. When I look at it, I'm reminded of the young man who came to Madrid, who made those studies or cartoons for the tapestries of frolics and picnics. And here, if you like, the career's come full circle.
A year after completing The Milkmaid, Goya died in Bordeaux on the 16th of April, 1828. He was 82, but in 1901 his body was returned to Spain and buried in the Hermitage of San Antonio de la Florida in Madrid, the very church where a century earlier he'd painted his frescoes. Goya's a pivotal figure in the history of art, an artist who reinvigorated traditional portraiture and religious devotional imagery. But ultimately it was Goya's unflinching vision that set him apart from almost any other painter in history. That searing, uncompromising gaze that enabled him to see and depict human frailty with an unprecedented directness and power which arguably has never yet been surpassed.